Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain, I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave, and so I rise.
I wish I dried up. I wish every drop of my milk slid past those pink lips and nourished the ground where the bones lay of my babies, starved while I feed their murderer. I wish I dried up, so the Mrs. Babies would dry up too, and be brittle, so I could crumble them to dust, return them to the ground where all my children of my bosom lay equal. Poem by Hess Love.
Hi, I'm Silver Pinov, and I am a doula, childbirth educator, former breastfeeding counselor, and parent educator. And I am here with Camille Barnes, who is a postpartum doula, a parent educator, and a student breastfeeding counselor. And we are excited to bring you a workshop for ProLC.
So we actually are going to be talking to you guys today about the history of breastfeeding in the Black community. We're going to start with, I want to talk to you a little bit about the poem I just read by Hess Love, and it is talking about wet nursing. Mm-hmm. So back in slavery times, Black women were forced to leave their children behind on the plantation and move into the house of the mistress and the master to nurse their babies. And when you listen to the lines of the poem, things like, I wish I dried up, she was probably lamenting very much about having to leave behind her own children to become malnourished. A lot of those babies died because they didn't have their mother's milk, while for usually reasons of vanity, the children in the house were, she had to feed and sustain them and watch her own children wither away and die. The line where she says, "I wish every drop of my milk slid past those pink lips and nourished the ground." She would rather have seen the milk wasted than to have to deal with the unfairness of watching her children become malnourished and watching these children grow and become healthy with the stolen milk. And then the line where she talks about she wishes that she could crumble up the dried bones of those babies and return them to the ground where all of her children of her bosom lay equal. Wasn't a thing of her being spiteful or angry at the babies necessarily, but not wanting to see the injustice in the supremacy, the legacy of supremacy that these children were born into.
And the inequality.
Right.
She's saying back to the ground where they're equal. Her babies' lives were just as valuable.
Right. And it's like, why steal the milk? What made your baby so much better that it deserved the milk that was stolen from mine? What made their lives so much more important?
And even just through all of that, it's also showing the complete lack of autonomy that slaves, but especially slave women, had over their body. To have to nourish someone else's child and not be able to nourish your own child. And we know about generational trauma, and this is something that is still impacting the Black community today.
Yes.
And it's something, kind of reading that poem, take a minute and just think about the words. Think about what it would be like to watch your own infant, not just not be fed, but to slowly wither away.
And starve to death.
It's not, a quick thing. It wasn't pass the baby off to grandma so grandma could bottle feed while you went to work as a nanny. This was, there is not enough resources to sustain my infant, but I have to go sustain this infant, the infant of my baby's murderers.
And, it's like they were taken from their babies. Think about your newborn being pulled away from you and you having to care for someone else's newborn and sustain the life of that child while your own baby is given substandard milk. The slave children were given cow's milk mixed with dirty water, or mushed up food just to try to sustain them, to get them through infancy.
And it wasn't what their bodies needed. It wasn't what their bodies could digest. It wasn't what could give them life.
And so a lot of them died from malnutrition.
And then the exposure, they weren't exactly living in hygienic quarters. They weren't given medical care. They weren't protected. And they had to give up their own bodies and their own children to sustain the lives of the people who own the plantation.
Right. And initially the children of the plantation owners were sent to the slave quarters to go live with the wet nurse through, until weaning. But they discovered that the babies weren't able to live. They were dying a lot faster because of the conditions of, because of their living conditions. And they thought that maybe that the women were killing the babies out of spite, but it was really just the living conditions were so bad that the babies weren't able to make it.
And so when we're kind of looking at breastfeeding it's an intimate experience. It's a bonding experience for a lot of women. And when we're taking all of that history and we're kind of thinking about it, we can see how even though we're like, oh, this was 150 years ago, this was 200 years ago, 300 years ago, it still impacts. It's that generational trauma, and it still shaped the culture.
And it impacts the parent-child relationship in a lot of ways, too. A lot of mothers, a lot of Black mothers I've heard say that they don't want their baby to become too attached to them. But that's a stigma that was passed down, because imagine becoming attached to your baby and having to watch it die. So just to save their own mental health, a lot of them distance themselves emotionally so that it would lessen the severity of the trauma of watching their babies slowly die that way.
And that happens to the next generation because there wasn't that healthy attachment with great-great-great-grandma, and then great-grandma, and then great-grandma, grandma, mom. To the current generation, we have a whole disconnect of poor parent-child attachment because you have to break the cycle somewhere. And this is where education and support come into play. So this is why we want to touch on the history, because you can't support a community
if you don't understand them.
If you don't understand why. You have to understand the whys and what led to this situation before you can address the situation.
Right. And we're going to talk to you a little bit about why the Black community moved away from nursing, and this was a huge part of it. When women, when they left the plantation, whether it was, whether they ran away or, after slavery was abolished, they moved away from it because a lot of the memories were just a little bit too painful, and there's still that inherent fear that I could lose my child could be taken from me.
And we still see that in some respects with the disproportionate involvement and removal of children in minority homes by CPS, which is a whole other discussion. But just to kind of touch on, we still see some of that trauma and fear of separating moms and babies.
Right.
And so when you combine that with the history and then that generational trauma with today's still risk of mother-child time apart, separation, it isn't quite as surprising then when you look at some of the statistics, because you can kind of understand why there's lower breastfeeding rates in some communities.
And, and the trauma of having to nurse a child, but having been through the trauma, or even we know that trauma is passed from mother to child. We know that stress and anxiety can be passed from mother to child. And some things can be taught. Some of that stress can be taught, meaning as a warning, maybe the grandmother tells the mother, don't start nursing the baby because you don't want this to happen, you don't want that to happen. And so a lot of, through generations, a lot of women stopped. And also another reason was that a lot of them were forced to go back to work very early. Like, in the 80s, it was commonplace to have 6 weeks maternity leave. But if you were born on a plantation, you didn't have maternity leave. You gave birth and you went back to doing whatever it is you needed to do. You didn't have time to recover.
And that became the standard in the Black community. That became where we see women going back to work. I mean, in the U.S., 25% of women return to work or school within 2 weeks of giving birth. And some of that in the Black community stems from there was an expectation and there was no choice.
Right.
And then that becomes a culture's norm. And so, well, great-great-grandmother survived this, you can do it too. And you should do it too. You're strong, you can do it type of thing. Even though that's not how it needs to be, we have to break those cultural stigmas. And also the socioeconomic reasons women have to return to work so early.
And more formula was pushed, and cereal in the bottles, table food early because they wanted the babies to sleep longer, because you need rest to recover from giving birth, but then you also need rest to be able to work efficiently. So you needed your baby to sleep. And so through the years of them supplementing with formula or table food and baby cereal, those things were kind of passed down as shoulds. So your baby is supposed to sleep through the night, 8 hours, 2-3 weeks in. I myself was told with my oldest, who was exclusively breastfed, give that baby cereal when he was 2 weeks old, because he was waking up every 2 hours. I'm like, this is what he's supposed to do. But when people don't have the education readily available to them, which happens a lot because of socioeconomic disparities, marketing of certain services, like lactation consultants aren't generally pushed into minority communities.
The minority community hospitals tend not to have lactation services in there. Right. The hospital that I interned with back in 2009, they had a lactation consultant for 1 hour once a week. And this was a hospital that primarily served the Black and Hispanic community, and their breastfeeding rate was initially 0% initiation, and with the addition of the lactation consultant, it moved up to about 2 to 3%. But that was for just 1 hour. So if we looked at, how high could it have been if they had adequate resources, adequate access to lactation services, it could have been significantly higher. And so there are parts of the Black community that just remain completely underserved. And so when you combine that along with the history, it makes a lot of sense that we see lower rates. Now, they are increasing, and we're going to kind of talk about that, but it took longer to increase in the Black community compared to the rest of the United States. When we kind of started seeing that shift and more information and education on getting back to breastfeeding after formula had been pushed through marketing. And there's a couple reasons
that formula was pushed.
And how the Black community kind of stepped away from breastfeeding. So, I mean, in addition to those painful memories, there's also this generational idea of protect your own body, be in charge of your own body. Women were, slave women were raped. They had to nurse somebody else's baby. They didn't get to decide how long they got to rest after they had a baby. They had to work constantly. Their bodies were pushed beyond what was physiologically healthy. They survived, and that became the expectation. And so some of it is this idea of maintaining your body autonomy, not having to nurse the baby, not having to give up your body. And while we know that you can reclaim that autonomy by making the decision to breastfeed, it can still be difficult to overcome that, especially if you heard these things from your grandmother, your great-grandmother, and things like that, if these things had been passed down. And it was also stigmatized. If your great-grandmother was a wet nurse, you would probably have a negative association with breastfeeding. You're probably not going to see it as a positive thing. You're going to see it as something that led to harm. It led to other infants dying. You don't have a positive association of breastfeeding helping your family grow, helping to provide for your family.
And also being taught that it's not a positive experience as well. On top of being told things like you'll never be able to leave that baby, you'll never get any sleep, that baby will become too attached to you, there's also the stigma of the breast being sexualized, not being something that is used for feeding, but simply a pleasure tool.
And we saw this throughout all of the U.S. Where breasts were sexualized, but there was an over-sexualization of Black women. This is common knowledge then. We still see it today.
Yes.
It's why you have, people making remarks about a 13-year-old body.
Right.
And
not that doesn't go across the board.
Right.
But historically speaking, young girls on a plantation, as soon as they started menstruating, were a lot of times used for breeding purposes. And the plantation owners would come to these young enslaved girls and they would tell them, just to keep up their milk supply, that they were going to, suck their breasts. And a lot of those young women were raped. And so think about how triggering it is to have someone touching you without your permission. We all know that when babies, especially when they get older and they nurse, they can be very demanding, hands in your shirt and pulling on your clothes, and that can be triggering for someone who's dealt with sexual trauma. And so that also is another reason why a lot of women in the Black community historically had moved away from breastfeeding, because it was way too triggering for some, and it was also taught that it was, that's not what your breasts are for. You don't want your baby to share your breast with your husband. A lot of misconceptions because the education was not readily available for them.
Yeah, and another interesting thing that happened with that is, so first what happened is we started seeing that marketing push of formula, and it was pushed heavily on white women. And then because of Eurocentric culture, westernized culture, Black women wanted to be like white women because this was considered the social standard.
Right.
The social norm was to be able to afford formula.
And it gave you validity as a human. You have to remember that historically Black people were considered only 3/5 of a person.
Right.
And so there has always been the goal to level yourself with the white community.
Right.
So you do things, you try to assimilate to the culture so that you can be recognized and validated as a human. And a lot of people shy away from looking poor. They don't want to be looked at as less than economically or in any facet of life, really. And so it was like, well, this is what they're doing, so this is what I need to do.
It became a symbol. We saw it again, even in the white community, but formula became a symbol of having money, and breastfeeding was a sign that you were poor. And we still see this, across racial divides in certain areas, very rural communities, urban communities where people may be socioeconomically disadvantaged. They don't want to appear that way. And so, around World War II, when there really was a big push on formula and marketing and things like that, that really kind of almost like nail in the coffin on breastfeeding in a lot of communities, but especially within the Black community.
Right. And even tying that back in too, like a lot of white women didn't want to breastfeed because they were afraid of losing their figures. They didn't want their breasts to sag.
Which we know these things don't happen.
Right.
But
it's like, so that was the fear. So it was like wet nursing was the thing, that gave you status. You were looked at as less than socioeconomically, like you were poor and destitute if you had to nurse your own baby, which also pushed the formula thing. And there were even doctors who were paid to say that breastfeeding was not good for you, and so it was better to have formula. And so that's why that was pushed so much more. And then trying to distance yourself from that that view of being poor, that view of the wet nurse, being seen as the wet nurse, being seen as the worker, and not being able to afford formula, not having the same status was another reason that a lot of Black people moved away from it. And also too, it almost became a necessity because Black women were forced to go back to work so soon, even off the plantation, even in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and 90s, because they had to go to work.
Or their food.
Right.
They didn't have food. And the thing that is, there was it had been commonplace for most white households in the 50s to have a stay-at-home mom. It was typical, it was it was what they saw as the norm. Yes, did some women work? Absolutely. But that was almost the exception, not the rule. Up through even in the 80s, it was like, oh, your mom works? It was considered unusual. However, in the Black community, there was no such shift.
No.
Even in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s.
Even in the 1800s,
they were
working.
They were working, but, they went into suburban communities and were the help. They raised other people's children while taking their children to grandma's, aunts, cousin's house, neighbor. And they were pouring of themselves into raising someone else's family at the detriment, often, of their own family, because there weren't labor laws, there weren't restricted hours, there wasn't a minimum wage, there wasn't fair wages. It was, this is the only job that's available to you, and your family needs to eat.
Right. And because of all of those things too, breastfeeding, because you had the stay-at-home moms that were white and they nursed their babies, breastfeeding became seen as a white thing. That's what white people do. White women do that. We don't do that. Which is so unfortunate. And so unfortunate that was the narrative that was pushed.
And really, it was once breastfeeding became popular in the white community again that we kind of started to see the Black community breastfeed again. Because again, we are unfortunately a very Eurocentric culture.
Yes.
We we see the Eurocentric beauty standards, we see the Eurocentric family structures, we see the Eurocentric, drive for socioeconomic independence and individualism and things like that. And so that led to once, 90s, early 2000s, as we kind of started seeing these public health education on breastfeeding, it rose in the white community first.
Right.
And then we started seeing an increase in the Black community. And this isn't to say no Black women have ever breastfed. This isn't to say no Black women are educated. This is like a generalization of the Black community. We're not speaking to individuals.
Right. And also just giving you information on why certain Black people choose or not choose, or in the past, throughout history, have chosen or not chosen to breastfeed.
Yes, and one of the biases that can kind of come up too is the assumption that every Black person is a Black American in the sense that they grew up with Black culture. So, you know, we have people coming from Africa that don't have a history
Haiti,
of slaves.
Jamaica.
We have people from, you know, Haiti, Jamaica, other Caribbean islands, South America, things like that. And that culture is a little bit different.
Right.
They didn't always have that same negative association with breastfeeding at the same time. We do see, unfortunately, in nearly all countries, a time where formula was or still is being pushed heavily, but it's received a little bit differently. There's not the same generational trauma associated with breastfeeding. And then the other really interesting thing was the National Geographic effect.
The shame associated with indigenous parenting styles, meaning we were
They're
shown
half
pictures
nude.
of savage people walking around with, you know, their tops off, nursing babies in the jungle, which is not what most African
And
countries
even
look like anyway.
if they were like, even though there's nothing wrong with indigenous culture. There's
Very
nothing
much.
wrong with village lifestyle. There's nothing wrong with natural clothing of the human body. But this is what was fed
The
as
shame.
National Geographic, you know, kind of push. And there was always a push of Black Americans have always tried to be equal. They are equally human, but they have not always been treated equally human. We've not always been told we're equal.
Well,
And so
a lot of times Black Americans have been punished for embracing their cultural and indigenous histories and culture, and practices versus aligning with the more Eurocentric values and standard here in America. And so a lot of times Black people distanced themselves or attempted to distance themselves from a lot of the things that were
they wanted to
associated with.
They didn't want to be Africans.
Right.
Because the media pushed Africans as being
Bad.
savage. And of course, we all know that Africa is not a single country. It's not a single culture. It's not a single group of people. It's about as descriptive as saying European. But
Right.
there was that narrative was pushed. There was this idea that all Africans were this indigenous thing and that indigenous is bad and that indigenous parenting and breastfeeding was bad. And so a lot of Black women didn't want to be associated or seen like Africans.
And to align with that, because it was taught to be, you were taught to be ashamed of that association.
Right. Which is so unfortunate, and it's something that we still see today. But if you want to be a provider who's able to kind of support women who are hoping to breastfeed, understanding where some of this generational trauma comes from, some of the stereotypes and stigmas, it's important that you understand it. So I know we're kind of throwing a lot of information at you and things like that, but we just want to make sure that you understand the underlying implications and how it influences. The other thing, again, that we kind of said, don't make assumptions or biases. We are providing information. We're providing historical facts. Every person is an individual. Every family has their own cultural norms within their family. So this isn't to say you should assume that if you have a Black client, their mother never breastfed or they wouldn't be interested in breastfeeding. This is if you have someone who is reluctant to breastfeed. There could be a variety of reasons, but some of it sometimes is a cultural thing and generational trauma and wanting independence or just practical stuff like having to go back to work very early.
It also, a lot of this colors the assumptions of providers who just assume that Black women are not going to breastfeed.
Yes.
And so a lot of, and this is moving out of the history and into the present a little bit, but a lot of Black women, or women of color in general, are not necessarily asked, what their preference is in the hospital. It is more so assume that you're going to use formula. The question is more often, what type of formula are you going to be using versus are you going to breastfeed or formula feed? And so then a lot of women feel pressured to use the formula, or they're told that, oh, your baby's so hungry, you need to give them formula so that they're, getting enough, because they're not educated in milk production about colostrum and that being enough while your milk is coming in. And there's all of these things, and
and representation.
Yes.
We see, when we first started seeing, a lot of public health things about breastfeeding and things like that, if it didn't include somebody that looks like you, it doesn't necessarily reach you.
Right, and you just attribute it to that's what they do.
Mm-hmm.
I can speak from my own situation. I always knew I was going to nurse my children. But I noticed that the people around me, when they saw how open I was with breastfeeding, because the other thing too is culturally, Black women were taught to be modest. You cover up
To kind of
good
counteract that over-sexualization that happened in the culture.
Right. I mean, we all know that public breastfeeding has been a challenge for everyone, every woman of every color. But it's, you cover up, so you don't do that in public. You don't do that at a restaurant. You don't do that at the mall. I definitely was questioned. Do you need to do that here? Can't you go in a bathroom? And it's like, no. But it is normalizing that for people who look like you. And so once I made that choice, friends who had babies within that first year of my son being born were more encouraged to do it and more encouraged to do extended breastfeeding because it became normalized.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people felt like when your baby gets teeth, they need to stop nursing. They're too old.
Or there's, I think too, in the Black community, there's the idea, don't let your child be too attached. And breastfeeding makes baby attached. There's a cultural norm that kind of stem from women having to go back to work. That your infant be comfortable getting put to sleep by anybody, being comfortable spending the night at grandma's or Aunt Sally's or whoever's house. And if you are like, no, it's okay, we're breastfeeding or whatever, sometimes there's this idea of, well, your grandmother helped with you, so I get to help with your baby.
Right, and you don't want your baby to be spoiled,
Mm-hmm.
which we all know that that's not the case. You cannot spoil an infant.
Mm-hmm.
But it does make it like, and also too, because of the history, and not just the history here, but culturally, even in Africa and, different countries where, our ancestries come from, traditionally, it's more of a communal raising, a village mindset of infancy where, you'll see people, you watch my baby and sure, you nurse my baby while I'm away because it's more of a village mindset.
Right.
Whereas here, it's a much more individualized family structure.
Mm-hmm. And there wouldn't be, and I think because of the stigma associated with slavery and wet nursing, you're less likely to see wet nursing within the Black community.
Right.
And not that it's overly common in the white community in the United States, but just in general, it was never likely to become common in the Black community in the U.S. because of wet nursing was seen as being forced, not something you do to help raise someone within your family.
Right. And you were just taught that was, we don't do that. It's disgusting. There were a lot of negative associations with that.
Yeah.
And so there were women who, after slavery and after, was abolished and wet nursing was frowned upon because of the stigma attached to it from the plantation. There were women who still continued to do it because they were paid more than even butlers and housekeepers. That was one of the higher paying positions that a Black woman could have. And so it was the choosing between being ostracized by your community for carrying on something that was considered to be shameful, and they were even called prostitutes and shameless women, or choosing to feed your family.
Right. It's kind of something that you see, even today with the idea, back in the day when mom forums were popular and things like that, there was this whole thing back and forth where people would kind of shame women who went back to work or shame women who didn't go to work and things like that. And that wasn't a discussion within the Black community.
No. Because
you had to go to work to feed your children. Back in the day, again, not that there weren't ever stay-at-home Black parents, but just if we're looking generally, the Black community needed two-income households because they didn't get paid equally.
Because
they didn't have as much. They didn't have opportunities. They weren't educated as frequently. Formal education was limited to them in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're looking back, further generations back, there really was this idea where you had to either be ostracized by your community by making choices that
may not have been as acceptable to your community. I mean, and we can even tie that into to today with women who are exotic dancers or are in the music industry and may dress scantily or dance a certain way, they make a lot of money. And it's like some of them may feel that this is their only avenue to making a decent
They're dealing
income.
with the ostracization within their communities because of the benefit to them when they're limited with opportunity. And we saw that a lot with people after slavery, kind of having to make that decision between finding the opportunities or
holding on
uplifting up your entire community. And, that's a lot to be on one mother's shoulders.
Right.
And, if you're thinking about somebody who, while they were a slave, their job was being a wet nurse, after slavery, what skills and job, who's hiring? Who hired people who were slaves? They didn't get good wages.
At all.
They were paid poorly. Sharecropping opportunities, which was really just a ripoff.
And even those opportunities impacted the ability to nurse and to breastfeed their own children, because you can't be in the field all day long sharecropping and then be able to nurse your baby every hour and a half to 2 hours.
Right. It's just, we have to look at, again, this is the history, so we're not necessarily speaking to the current breastfeeding rates among people in the Black community, but when we're looking at it being lower than in other communities, this history kind of gives an explanation as to why.
Why it's lower and why it's been slow growing in some circumstances as well, and also to show you where a lot of these stereotypes come from about why Black women, whether or not they nurse or why they don't nurse, and even touching back to the whole stay-at-home mom piece, we run away from the stigma of Black women are lazy. Black people are lazy, and so we don't feel like we can stay home, even if we have the opportunity.
I was going to say, even when the income is there, even if they have a partner who, has a decent income, even if they have, maybe they worked for years and have savings and things like that, it is generally something that they shy away from because
it's frowned upon sometimes.
Yeah, and there's the assumption that they're staying home to live off the government, and these ridiculous, not true stereotypes that they constantly have to get away from, fight, change the narrative, and it's often at the detriment of their own bodies, overworking themselves, not taking time to heal for childbirth, not being able to breastfeed, and it can impact their children too. And these are all things that stem because of history, because of stereotypes, because of media, lack of representation. These are...
And not having the support.
Because we didn't have that. I mean, everybody kind of knows that story. I guess a lot of people who are familiar with lactation are familiar with the story of the gorilla in the zoo who had the baby and didn't know what to do with it and didn't feed it, and the baby kind of didn't survive. And, they had volunteer nursing moms come in when she was pregnant with the next time and nurse in front of her exhibit. And because she had never seen it before, she didn't know what to do the first time, but having seen it, she was able to kind of nurse the next one. And so this is similar to women in general. When we don't see something, if we have never been around it, if we're not comfortable with it, if we don't have people around us who can help and support and encourage, we're going to be less likely to breastfeed anyone. And then when we add in the fact that we had less great-grandmothers breastfeeding or great-great-grandmothers breastfeeding, it gets passed down. We have, the formula marketing was huge. It was a huge push. So lots of generations kind of missed out on having a relative who was familiar with breastfeeding, but it was a little bit higher within the Black community.
Right.
Because if you were still likely to have somebody somewhere who had breastfed in some communities, some white communities. Whereas, again, generalizations, but sometimes there was you just never saw it growing up.
And also, too, that's coupled along with, once again, the opportunity to be able to do it. There were more, it was more acceptable. And also, you think about all of the different support groups and, and education opportunities, like having a lactation consultant, being able to join things like the Leche League, knowing about kellymom.com and other websites may not necessarily be something that's discussed, because a lot of Black women, because they're working and go back to work so early, may not have access to all of these different moms groups and forums and things like that. And we've seen that progress extensively over the last 15 years or so, which has caused a huge increase in the numbers. But before the internet, before moms groups were a thing, it's not something that was really talked about or discussed.
Right.
And pumps were not always readily available, and we know the pricing of those was pretty expensive. So before insurance covered lactation consultants and breast pumps,
people who went back to work really just weren't likely to breastfeed. Because how do you keep up a supply without access to a breast pump? How do you maintain and learn without access to a lactation consultant? You know, if you have a family member, a friend, somebody within your own community, you're more likely to breastfeed.
Right.
Because you have that direct access, that direct knowledge. And so we're seeing an increase, but the history is why it's taken longer. And just kind of even, just for like when I was shadowing a lactation consultant, one of the things that I experienced is you have to understand it's not coming just from a lack of information about breastfeeding, but there's also still, those stigmas run really deep. And that over-sexualization of Black women impacts Black men. It impacts everyone within a community. And so I remember I was working with a lactation consultant. We went in to visit a mom, and she wanted to try and breastfeed. You know, she had probably heard about it at appointments and, you know, had pamphlets and books and things like that. She was a Black woman, and she was married to a Black man. And he was in the room with her, and every time she tried to breastfeed, he was visibly uncomfortable. He would say things like, "See, he's crying, the baby doesn't want it, this is disgusting." And, you know, me and the other lactation consultant were just working with her and helping her as long as she wants to help. And eventually she was like, you know what, it's just not going to work. She wanted to do it. But the stigma within her own circle was so heavy that it almost wasn't, I don't want to say it wasn't worth it, but you're tired. You just had a baby. You know,
that support is so important.
It was too difficult for her to keep that up with such negative support. And, you know, in one respect, you want to be like, I can't believe a man would do that. I can't believe a partner would do that. But you have to kind of understand where he might even be coming from. I'm certainly not condoning such behavior. I don't think that that's respectful behavior to a partner. But I think we can understand when we look at the history why he may have had such a negative view of it, because so many people were taught that was nasty, or it was gross, or it was unsanitary. It was what poor people did, and you didn't want to look poor. And again, that over-sexualization happens in a lot of communities. Breasts have been over-sexualized in every community for the most part, but Black women in general are over-sexualized in the media. And so for the partner, it was uncomfortable. It visibly made him uncomfortable. You could tell it wasn't just him being rude. It was a general visceral reaction to it, because who knows how much he's been hearing about how disgusting breastfeeding is, or how over-sexualized things have been in where he grew up and things like that. You know, it just wasn't gonna, you know, it was too difficult for them in that moment, because we're only addressing it after the baby's been born.
Right. And also too, it was stigmatized as being a white thing. That's what white women do. And in the quest for Black empowerment to overcome all of the years of oppression, there was the whole, instead of trying to assimilate, we're going to separate and try to embrace our own culture. And so it's like, well, we don't want to associate ourselves with something that is, you know, associated with the people who we feel like are so against us. And that coupled along with the fact that sometimes that's used as a shame tactic.
Right.
You know, why are you trying to be like them? Or why can't you just be comfortable being you? Right. That's not what we do.
Right.
Even when what we do is not good.
Correct. Yeah, I think, and then on the flip side, so we had a discomfort, a history, a family norm that made this man visibly uncomfortable. And then we flip it to, sometimes we have providers who have biases, who make assumptions. Humans are human. We think things, we all have our unconscious bias, and as providers, as professionals, we have to be aware of them, and we have to kind of counteract that with information and knowledge, and be aware of our words, what we say. We all probably at times say the wrong thing. It happens. It's just the idea of making sure that we are conscious of it and we try and work over it. But there can be this assumption when there are some providers who see the black mom, who see the young mom, who see a minority, and make the assumption that they're probably not going to breastfeed. So why, you don't need to put the effort in. Or even just the language that you might use. So maybe maybe there's a pediatrician who's super pro breastfeeding, but the unconscious bias when a new mom comes might be, oh, what formula are you using? Rather than just asking, how's feeding going? And finding out what they're, how they're feeding and things like that. And because our language influences how people think.
Yes.
I remember taking my son to a pediatrician, allergist appointment. And this was a very holistic doctor's office. My assumption is they would totally be pro breastfeeding. I had seen a different doctor there. They were familiar with breastfeeding. My son nursed, I don't remember how long, but he was well over a year. He was almost 2. And he was probably 14, 15, 16 months, something like that. And I remember them asking, oh, what formula are you using? Or what formula did you use? And I remember being confused because that was their first question at this super holistic, thing. Now, can I say with certainty that was his bias? No. But that was my initial internal experience based on other experiences that I had had. Mm-hmm. When that same child was born, he was in the hospital. He had come home, and then we had to go back for some other things. And while we were in there, I probably had at least 3 people shocked that I was breastfeeding. Completely surprised, caught off guard, asked if I needed a lactation consult. Was I sure that I was breastfeeding? Was I sure things were going well? This was a kid who was gaining almost a pound a week. We had it down, but there was a lot of assumption that this young minority mom either A, wasn't breastfeeding, or B, wouldn't be able to properly breastfeed. Yeah. And so that colors how you feel. And it almost makes you wonder, is this weird? Should I not have been? And really the only reason that I think I was so into breastfeeding is, I was adopted. My biological mom breastfed the kids that she had when they were infants. My adopted mom talked about breastfeeding. So I had always been breastfeeding was the norm for me. You have a baby, you breastfeed. And so that was an experience that I had that wasn't necessarily what everyone has.
Right. And I actually, on the opposite end of that, was not breastfed.
I wasn't.
I didn't know.
The other ones
right.
were.
But I also, my mom just had me, but I wasn't breastfed. I don't know. I really didn't know anyone else who did it. I'm actually not even really sure why I was so enamored with breastfeeding my own children. I just always, from a teenager, knew that was something that I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have a ton of exposure to it, but I educated myself a lot about it. Mm-hmm. But it does make a huge difference to see other people. So I actually worked I worked at a daycare, and so I worked around a lot of women who would come I worked at a daycare that was associated with a hospital, so the doctors and nurses would come over and nurse during
lunch or whatever.
Right. Yeah. And their breaks. And so that exposed me even more so, oh wow, and I have, friends.
And seeing people that went back to work and were able to do it and things like that.
So it did make a huge difference in seeing that and learning more about proper nutrition, learning more about different foods to help increase your milk so that you don't have to give up so quickly if you're not going to.
And I think that's the other thing, though, too, is the idea we have these education campaigns that hyper-focus on mom's diet, on mom's lifestyle, on mom's everything, and that can influence, it makes them want to it can make people want to give up because you're you need to do this and this and this rather than just discussing hey, women have nursed during a famine and they're okay, but we want you to eat well so you feel good. Right. Rather than hyper-focusing on like, education is super important, but it has to be evidence-based education. It can't be the education that's going to make it overwhelming. Which I'm sure that, like, as lactation consultants and stuff like that, you know, you guys have that down. But just kind of understanding, I think, so we're kind of covering two things. One being, don't make the assumption based on history that a minority or a black person is not going to be breastfed. But also, if you are noticing disinterest or discomfort or struggling or lack of family support, understanding the history is part of how you can best approach them.
Right. And also, too, I'd like to point out that it's really hard to serve a community that you don't understand. And so if you can, I would suggest taking the opportunity to volunteer with some low-income agencies, low-income programming that and volunteering maybe an hour or two a month to teaching breastfeeding and getting to know the people in those communities so that you can learn how to engage with them and get rid of some of your own unconscious biases that may be there, because that will help you to understand your client a lot more, and it will help you to do better as a lactation consultant in your own field, in your own businesses.
And I think that it's just understanding that this history crosses socioeconomic boundaries.
Yes.
It crosses education. It crosses a lot. But it should never be used to feed the unconscious bias that you already have. It is just another tool to help you in engaging with certain communities. And I think the best thing for interculture care providers and support is, if you don't know, ask a question. You know, you don't have to just assume if somebody is struggling with breastfeeding, be like, oh, is this because you don't see it a lot in your community? You can say something like, so what experiences do you have? Or, what are you struggling with? It could be something as simple as, my neck hurts, or I'm overtired, I don't have enough help at home, or I have to go back to school next week.
Or they're stressed about making enough milk.
Or, their cousin Sally told them they need to get a pump already and be ready to pump, and they're just trying to figure out breastfeeding, and they had a baby 2 days ago, and they're like, I can't figure out the pump. Like, moms are moms. A lot of them struggle with the same things regardless of their culture, regardless of their background, but being familiar with that culture can help in engaging and supporting. Just make sure that you ask questions, not make assumptions. And we're going to touch on that more in the live session. We're going to kind of talk about how to apply the knowledge of this history and how it implicates current breastfeeding rates, and how to engage with the community, and how to support women, and how you can, as Camille was kind of talking about volunteer opportunities, how can we all as professionals help increase breastfeeding rates? What can we all do to help increase maternal health and infant health and things like that?
And to spread outreach, to give a larger reach into different communities as opposed to just one centralized group of people.
But the formula he grows on must be his own exclusively. All babies are different. That's why hospitals send more babies home on formulas made with pet evaporated milk than on any other form of milk. For a pet milk formula is flexible. It can be adjusted exactly to each baby's need. Your doctor prescribes the formula, the amount of water and pet milk to use, the kind and amount of sugar or syrup to add. A pet milk formula fits your baby's needs as no ready-made formula ever can.
Part 2 of this session is going to be live. What we want you to do before the next session is to take time to reflect on the history which was discussed today. What were you thinking and feeling? What came to your mind when you heard the words from Hess Love? What might her emotions and experience do as she shares them with her children and they share it with their children? What impact might our history have on breastfeeding rates? You know, what socioeconomic factors in the past and the present might influence breastfeeding today? And, you know, what role does the media have? You know, how did the National Geographic effect influence breastfeeding in the United States and specifically within the Black community? You know, and what is the media doing today? We would really like for you guys to just take some time to reflect on these things. Come with your questions, your thoughts. We would love to discuss them with you during the live session and really work together to kind of find some solutions and ways to improve breastfeeding rates within the Black community.